Chapter 5 of the Holy War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Joy Chan. The Holy War by John Bunyan. Chapter 5. So when Emmanuel saw that Mansoul was thus involved in sin, he calls his army together, since now also his words were despised, and gave out a commandment throughout all his host to be ready against the time appointed. Now, forasmuch as there was no way lawfully to take the town of Mansoul, but to get in by the gates, and at Eargate as the chief, therefore he commanded his captains and commanders to bring their arms, their slings, and their men, and place them at Eargate and Eargate, in order to his taking the town. When Emmanuel had put all things in a readiness to give Diabolus battle, he sent again to know of the town of Mansoul, if in peaceable manner they would yield themselves, or whether they were yet resolved to put him to try the utmost extremity. They then, together with Diabolus their king, called a council of war, and resolved upon certain propositions that should be offered to Emmanuel, if he will accept thereof. So they agreed. And then the next was, who should be sent on this errand? Now there was in the town of Mansoul an old man, a Diabolonian, and his name was Mr. Loath to Stoop, a stiff man in his way, and a great doer for Diabolus. Him therefore they sent, and put into his mouth what he should say. So he went and came to the camp of Emmanuel. And when he was come, a time was appointed to give him audience. So at the time he came, and after a Diabolonian ceremony or two, he thus began and said, Great sir, that it may be known unto all men how good-natured a prince my master is, he has sent me to tell your lordship that he is very willing, rather than go to war, to deliver up into your hands 1/2 of the town of Mansoul. I am therefore to know if your mightiness will accept of this proposition. Then said Emmanuel, The whole is mine by gift and purchase, wherefore I will never lose 1/2. Then said Mr. Loath to Stoop, Sir, my master hath said that he will be content that you shall be the nominal and titular lord of all, if he may possess but a part. Then Emmanuel answered, The whole is mine really, not in name and word only, wherefore I will be the sole lord and possessor of all, or of none at all, of Mansoul. Then Mr. Loath to Stoop said again, Sir, behold the condescension of my master. He says that he will be content, if he may but have assigned to him some place in Mansoul as a place to live privately in, and you shall be lord of all the rest. Then said the Golden Prince, All that the Father giveth me shall come to me, and of all that he giveth me I will lose nothing, no, not a hoof nor a hair. I will not therefore grant him, no, not the least corner of Mansoul to dwell in. I will have all to myself. Then Mr. Loath to Stoop said again, But, sir, suppose that my lord should resign the whole town to you, only with this proviso, that he sometimes, when he comes into this country, may, for old acquaintance sake, be entertained as a wayfaring man for 2 days, or 10 days, or a month or so. May not this small matter be granted? Then said Emmanuel, No. He came as a wayfaring man to David, nor did he stay long with him, and yet it had like to have cost David his soul. I will not consent that he ever should have any harbour more there. Then said Mr. Loath to Stoop, Sir, you seem to be very hard. Suppose my master should yield to all that your lordship hath said, provided that his friends and kindred in Mansoul may have liberty to trade in the town, and to enjoy their present dwellings. May not that be granted, sir? Then said Emmanuel, No, that is contrary to my father's will. For all, and all manner of Diabolonians that now are, or that at any time shall be found in Mansoul, shall not only lose their lands and liberties, but also their lives. Then said Mr. Loath to Stoop again, But, sir, may not my master and great lord, by letters, by passengers, by accidental opportunities, and the like, maintain, and if he shall deliver up all unto thee, some kind of old friendship with Mansoul? Emmanuel answered, No, by no means, forasmuch as any such fellowship, friendship, intimacy, or acquaintance, in what way, sort, or mode soever maintained, will tend to the corrupting of man's soul, the alienating of their affections from me, and the endangering of their peace with my Father. Mr. Loath to stoop, yet added further, saying, But, great sir, since my master hath many friends, and those that are dear to him, in man's soul, may he not, if he shall depart from them, even of his bounty and good nature, bestow upon them, as he sees fit, some tokens of his love and kindness that he had for them, to the end that man's soul, when he is gone, may look upon such tokens of kindness once received from their old friend, and remember him who was once their king, and the merry times that they sometimes enjoyed one with another, while he and they lived in peace together. Then said Emmanuel, No, for if Mansoul come to be mine, I shall not admit of, nor consent that there should be the least scrap, shred, or dust of Diabolus left behind, as tokens of gifts bestowed upon any in man's soul, thereby to call to remembrance the horrible communion that was betwixt them and him. Well, sir, said Mr. Loath to stoop, I have one thing more to propound, and then I am got to the end of my commission. Suppose that, when my master is gone from Mansoul, any that shall yet live in the town should have such business of high concerns to do, that if they be neglected the party shall be undone. And suppose, sir, that nobody can help in that case so well as my master and lord, may not now my master be sent for upon so urgent an occasion as this? Or if he may not be admitted into the town, may not he and the person concerned meet in some of the villages near Mansoul, and there lay their heads together, and there consult of matters? This was the last of those ensnaring propositions that Mr. Loath to stoop had to propound to Emmanuel on behalf of his master Diabolus. But Emmanuel would not grant it, for he said, There can be no case or thing or matter fall out in man's soul, when thy master shall be gone, that may not be solved by my father. Besides, it will be a great disparagement to my father's wisdom and skill to admit any from Mansoul to go out to Diabolus for advice, when they are bid before, in everything, by prayer and supplication, to let their requests be made known to my father. Further, this, should it be granted, would be to grant that a door should be set open for Diabolus and the Diabolonians in Mansoul to hatch and plot, and bring to pass treasonable designs, to the grief of my father and me, and to the utter destruction of Mansoul. When Mr. Loath to stoop had heard this answer, he took his leave of Emmanuel and departed, saying that he would carry word to his master concerning this whole affair. So he departed and came to Diabolus to Mansoul, and told him the whole of the matter, and how Emmanuel would not admit, no, not by any means, that he, when he was once got out, should for ever have anything more to do either in or with any that are of the town of Mansoul. When Mansoul and Diabolus had heard this relation of things, they with one consent concluded to use their best endeavour to keep Emmanuel out of Mansoul, and sent old Ill-Pause, of whom you have heard before, to tell the prince and his captain so. So the old gentleman came up to the top of Eargate, and called to the camp for a hearing, who when they gave audience he said, I have a commandment from my high lord to bid you tell it to your Prince Emmanuel, that Mansoul and their king are resolved to stand and fall together, and that it is in vain for your prince to think of ever having Mansoul in his hand, unless he can take it by force. So some went and told to Emmanuel what old Ill-Pause, a Diabolonian in Mansoul, had said. Then said the prince, I must try the power of my sword, for I will not, for all the rebellions and repulses that Mansoul has made against me, raise my siege and depart, but will assuredly take my Mansoul, and deliver it from the hand of her enemy. And with that he gave out a commandment that Captain Boanerges, Captain Conviction, Captain Judgment, and Captain Execution should forthwith march up to Eargate with trumpets sounding, colours flying, and with shouting for the battle. Also he would that Captain Credence should join himself with them. Emmanuel, moreover, gave order that Captain Goodhope and Captain Charity should draw themselves up before Ighgate. He bid also that the rest of his captains and their men should place themselves for the best of their advantage against the enemy round about the town. And all was done as he had commanded. Then he bid that the word should be given forth, and the word was at that time Emmanuel. Then was an alarm sounded, and the battering rams were played, and the slings did whirl stones into the town amain, and thus the battle began. Now Diabolus himself did manage the townsmen in the war, and that at every gate, wherefore their resistance was the more forcible, hellish, and offensive to Emmanuel. Thus was the good prince engaged and entertained by Diabolus and Mansoul for several days together. And a sight worth seeing it was to behold how the captains of Shaddai behaved themselves in this war. And first for Captain Boanerges, not to undervalue the rest, he made 3 most fierce assaults, one after another, upon Eargate, to the shaking of the posts thereof. Captain Conviction, he also made up as fast with Boanerges as possibly he could, and both discerning that the gate began to yield, they commanded that the rams should still be played against it. Now Captain Conviction, going up very near to the gate, was with great force driven back, and received 3 wounds in the mouth. And those that rode reformades, they went about to encourage the captains. For the valour of the 2 captains made mention of before, the prince sent for them to his pavilion, and commanded that a while they should rest themselves, and that with somewhat they should be refreshed. Care also was taken for Captain Conviction that he should be healed of his wounds. The prince also gave to each of them a chain of gold, and bid them yet be of good courage. Nor did Captain Goodhope nor Captain Charity come behind in this most desperate fight, for they so well did behave themselves at Ighgate that they had almost broken it quite open. These also had a reward from their prince, as also had the rest of the captains, because they did valiantly round about the town. In this engagement several of the officers of Diabolus were slain, and some of the townsmen wounded. For the officers there was one Captain Boasting slain. This Boasting thought that nobody could have shaken the posts of Eargate, nor have shaken the heart of Diabolus. Next to him there was one Captain Secure slain. This Secure used to say that the blind and lame in Mansoul were able to keep the gates of the town against Emmanuel's army. This Captain Secure did Captain Conviction cleave down the head with a 2-handed sword, when he received himself 3 wounds in his mouth. Besides these there was one Captain Bragman, a very desperate fellow, and he was captain over a band of those that threw firebrands, arrows, and death. He also received, by the hand of Captain Goodhope at Ighgate, a mortal wound in the breast. There was moreover one Mr. Feeling, but he was no captain, but a great stickler to encourage Mansoul to rebellion. He received a wound in the eye by the hand of one of Boanerges' soldiers, and had by the captain himself been slain, but that he made a sudden retreat. But I never saw Will-be-will so daunted in all my life. He was not able to do as he was wont, and some say that he also received a wound in the leg, and that some of the men in the prince's army have certainly seen him limp as he afterwards walked on the wall. I shall not give you a particular account of the names of the soldiers that were slain in the town, for many were maimed and wounded and slain. For when they saw that the posts of Eargate did shake, and Ighgate was well nigh broken quite open, and also that their captains were slain, this took away the hearts of many of the Diabolonians. They fell also by the force of the shot that was sent by the golden slings into the midst of the town of Mansoul. Of the townsmen there was one Love-no-good. He was a townsman, but a Diabolonian. He also received his mortal wound in Mansoul, but he died not very soon. Mr. Ill-Pause also, who was the man that came along with Diabolus when at first he attempted the taking of Mansoul, he also received a grievous wound in the head. Some say that his brain-pan was cracked. This I have taken notice of, that he was never after this able to do that mischief to Mansoul as he had done in times past. Also old Prejudice and Mr. Anything fled. Now when the battle was over, the Prince commanded that yet once more the white flag should be set upon Mount Gracious in sight of the town of Mansoul, to show that yet Emmanuel had grace for the wretched town of Mansoul. When Diabolus saw the white flag hung out again, and knowing that it was not for him but Mansoul, he cast in his mind to play another prank, to wit, to see if Emmanuel would raise his siege and be gone upon promise of reformation. So he comes down to the gate one evening, a good while after the sun was gone down, and calls to speak with Emmanuel, who presently came down to the gate. And Diabolus saith unto him, Forasmuch as thou makest appear by thy white flag that thou art wholly given to peace and quiet, I thought meet to acquaint thee that we are ready to accept thereof upon terms which thou mayest admit. I know that thou art given to devotion, and that holiness pleaseth thee. Yea, that thy great end in making a war upon Mansoul is, that it may be a holy habitation. Well, draw off thy forces from the town, and I will bend Mansoul to thy bow. First, I will lay down all acts of hostility against thee, and will be willing to become thy deputy, and will, as I have formerly been against thee, now serve thee in the town of Mansoul. And more particularly, 1. I will persuade Mansoul to receive thee for their lord, and I know that they will do it the sooner when they shall understand that I am thy deputy. 2. I will show them wherein they have erred, and that transgression stands in the way to life. 3. I will show them the holy law unto which they must conform, even that which they have broken. 4. I will press upon them the necessity of a reformation according to thy law. 5. And, moreover, that none of these things may fail, I myself at my own proper cost and charge will set up and maintain a sufficient ministry, besides lectures, in Mansoul. 6. Thou shalt receive, as a token of our subjection to thee, year by year, what thou shalt think fit to lay and levy upon us in token of our subjection to thee. Then said Emmanuel to him, O full of deceit, how movable are thy ways! How often hast thou changed and rechanged, if so be thou mightest still keep possession of my Mansoul, though, as has been plainly declared before, I am the right heir thereof. Often hast thou made thy proposals already, nor is this last a whit better than they. And failing to deceive when thou showest thyself in thy black, thou hast now transformed thyself into an angel of light, and wouldst, to deceive, be now as a minister of righteousness. But know thou, O Diabolus, that nothing must be regarded that thou canst propound, for nothing is done by thee but to deceive. Thou neither hast conscience to God, nor love to the town of Mansoul. Whence then should these thy sayings arise but from sinful craft and deceit? He that can of list and will propound what he pleases, and that wherewith he may destroy them that believe him, is to be abandoned, with all that he shall say. But if righteousness be such a beauty spot in thine eyes now, how is it that wickedness was so closely stuck to by thee before? But this is by the by. Thou talkest now of a reformation in man's soul, and that thou thyself, if I will please, wilt be at the head of that reformation, all the while knowing that the greatest proficiency that man can make in the law and the righteousness thereof will amount to no more, for the taking away of the curse from man's soul, than just nothing at all. For a law being broken by man's soul, that had before, upon a supposition of the breach thereof, a curse pronounced against him for it of God, can never, by his obeying of the law, deliver himself therefrom, to say nothing of what a reformation is like to be set up in man's soul when the devil is become corrector of vice. Thou knowest that all that thou hast now said in this matter is nothing but guile and deceit, and is, as it was the first, so is it the last card that thou hast to play. Many there be that do soon discern thee when thou showest them thy cloven foot, but in thy white, thy light, and in thy transformation thou art seen but of a few. But thou shalt not do thus with my Mansoul, O Diabolus, for I do still love my Mansoul. Besides, I am not come to put Mansoul upon works to live thereby. Should I do so, I should be like unto thee, But I am come that by me, and by what I have and shall do for Mansoul, they may to my father be reconciled, though by their sin they have provoked him to anger, and though by the law they cannot obtain mercy. Thou talkest of subjecting of this town to good, when none desireth it at thy hands. I am sent by my father to possess it myself, and to guide it by the skilfulness of my hands into such a conformity to him as shall be pleasing in his sight. I will therefore possess it myself. I will dispossess and cast thee out. I will set up mine own standard in the midst of them. I will also govern them by new laws, new officers, new motives, and new ways. Yea, I will pull down this town and build it again, and it shall be as though it had not been, and it shall then be the glory of the whole universe. When Diabolus heard this, and perceived that he was discovered in all his deceits, he was confounded and utterly put to a nonplus. But having in himself the fountain of iniquity, rage and malice against both Shaddai and his son, and the beloved town of Mansoul, what doth he but strengthen himself, what he could, to give fresh battle to the noble Prince Emmanuel? So then, now we must have another fight before the town of Mansoul is taken. Come up then to the mountains, you that love to see military actions, and behold by both sides how the fatal blow is given, while one seeks to hold, and the other seeks to make himself master of the famous town of Mansoul. Diabolus therefore, having withdrawn himself from the wall to his force that was in the heart of the town of Mansoul, Emmanuel also returned to the camp, and both of them, after their diverse ways, put themselves into a posture fit to give battle one to another. Diabolus, as filled with despair of retaining in his hands the famous town of Mansoul, resolved to do what mischief he could, if indeed he could do any, to the army of the prince and to the famous town of Mansoul. For alas, it was not the happiness of the silly town of Mansoul that was designed by Diabolus, but the utter ruin and overthrow thereof, as now is enough in view. Wherefore he commands his officers that they should then, when they see that they could hold the town no longer, do it what harm and mischief they could, rending and tearing men, women, and children. For, said he, we had better quite demolish the place, and leave it like a ruinous heap, than so leave it that it may be an habitation for Emmanuel. Emmanuel again, knowing that the next battle would issue in his being made master of the place, gave out a royal commandment to all his officers, high captains, and men of war, to be sure to show themselves men of war against Diabolus and all Diabolonians, but favourable, merciful, and meek to the old inhabitants of Mansoul. Bend, therefore, said the noble prince, the hottest front of the battle against Diabolus and his men. So the day being come, the command was given, and the prince's men did bravely stand to their arms, and did, as before, bend their main force against Eargate and Eygate. The word was then, Mansoul is won. So they made their assault upon the town. Diabolus also, as fast as he could, with the main of his power, made resistance from within, and his high lords and chief captains for a time fought very cruelly against the prince's army. But after 3 or 4 notable charges by the prince and his noble captains, Eargate was broken open, and the bars and bolts wherewith it was used to be fast shut up against the prince were broken into 1,000 pieces. Then did the prince's trumpet sound, the captains shout, the town shake, and Diabolus retreat to his hold. Well, when the prince's forces had broken open the gate, himself came up and did set his throne in it. Also he set his standard thereby, upon a mount that before by his men was cast up to place the mighty slings thereon. The mount was called Mount Hearwell. There therefore the prince abode, to wit, hard by the going in at the gate. He commanded also that the golden slings should yet be played upon the town, especially against the castle, because for shelter thither was Diabolus retreated. Now from Eargate the street was straight even to the house of Mr. Recorder, that so was before Diabolus took the town. And hard by his house stood the castle, which Diabolus for a long time had made his irksome den. The captains therefore did quickly clear that street by the use of their slings, so that way was made up to the heart of the town. Then did the prince command that Captain Boanerges, Captain Conviction, and Captain Judgment should forthwith march up the town to the old gentleman's gate. Then did the captains in most warlike manner enter into the town of Mansoul, and, marching in with flying colours, they came up to the recorder's house, and that was almost as strong as was the castle. Battering rams they took also with them to plant against the castle gates. When they were come to the house of Mr. Conscience, they knocked and demanded entrance. Now the old gentleman, not knowing as yet fully their design, kept his gates shut all the time of this fight. Wherefore Boanerges demanded entrance at his gates, and no man making answer, he gave it one stroke with the head of a ram, and this made the old gentleman shake, and his house to tremble and totter. Then came Mr. Recorder down to the gates, and, as he could, with quivering lips he asked who was there. Boanerges answered, "We are the captains and commanders of the great Shaddai and of the blessed Emmanuel, his son, and we demand possession of your house for the use of our noble prince." And with that the battering ram gave the gate another shake. This made the old gentleman tremble the more, yet durst he not but open the gate. Then the king's forces marched in, namely, the 3 brave captains mentioned before. Now the recorder's house was a place of much convenience for Emmanuel, not only because it was near to the castle and strong, but also because it was large and fronted the castle, the den where now Diabolus was, for he was now afraid to come out of his hold. As for Mr. Recorder, the captains carried it very reservedly to him, as yet he knew nothing of the great designs of Emmanuel, so that he did not know what judgment to make, nor what would be the end of such thundering beginnings. It was also presently noised in the town how the recorder's house was possessed, his rooms taken up, and his palace made the seat of the war. And no sooner was it noised abroad, but they took the alarm as warmly, and gave it out to others of his friends, and you know, as a snowball loses nothing by rolling, so in little time the whole town was possessed, that they must expect nothing from the prince but destruction. And the ground of the business was this: the recorder was afraid, the recorder trembled, and the captains carried it strangely to the recorder. So many came to see, but when they with their own eyes did behold the captains in the palace, and their battering rams ever playing at the castle gates to beat them down, they were riveted in their fears, and it made them all in amaze. And, as I said, the man of the house would increase all this, for whoever came to him, or discoursed with him, nothing would he talk of, tell them, or hear, but that death and destruction now attended Mansoul. For, quoth the old gentleman, you are all of you sensible that we all have been traitors to that once despised, but now famously victorious and glorious Prince Emmanuel. For he now, as you see, doth not only lie in close siege about us, but hath forced his entrance in at our gates. Moreover, Diabolus flees before him, and he hath, as you behold, made of my house a garrison against the castle where he is. I, for my part, have transgressed greatly, and he that is clean, it is well for him. But I say I have transgressed greatly in keeping silence when I should have spoken, and in perverting justice when I should have executed the same. True, I have suffered something at the hand of Diabolus for taking part with the laws of King Shaddai, but that, alas, what will that do? Will that make compensation for the rebellions and treasons that I have done, and have suffered without gainsaying to be committed in the town of Mansoul? Oh, I tremble to think what will be the end of this so dreadful and so ireful a beginning. Now, while these brave captains were thus busy in the house of the old recorder, Captain Execution was as busy in other parts of the town, in securing the back streets and the walls. He also hunted the Lord Will-be-will sorely. He suffered him not to rest in any corner. He pursued him so hard that he drove his men from him, and made him glad to thrust his head into a hole. Also this mighty warrior did cut 3 of the Lord Will-be-will's officers down to the ground. One was old Mr. Prejudice, he that had his crown cracked in the mutiny. This man was made by Lord Will-be-will keeper of Eargate, and fell by the hand of Captain Execution. There was also one Mr. Backward to all but naught, and he also was one of Lord Wilbywill's officers, and was the captain of the 2 guns that once were mounted on the top of Eargate. He also was cut down to the ground by the hands of Captain Execution. Besides these 2 there was another, a third, and his name was Captain Treacherous. A vile man this was, but one that Wilbywill did put a great deal of confidence in. But him also did this Captain Execution cut down to the ground with the rest. He also made a very great slaughter among my Lord Wilbywill's soldiers, killing many that were stout and sturdy, and wounding many that for Diabolus were nimble and active. But all these were Diabolonians. There was not a man, a native of Mansoul, hurt. Other feats of war were also likewise performed by other of the captains, as at Eygate, where Captain Goodhope and Captain Charity had a charge, was great execution done. For the Captain Goodhope with his own hands slew one Captain Blindfold, the keeper of that gate. This Blindfold was captain of 1,000 men, and they were they that fought with mauls. He also pursued his men, slew many, and wounded more, and made the rest hide their heads in corners. There was also at that gate Mr. Ill-Pause, of whom you have heard before. He was an old man, and had a beard that reached down to his girdle. The same was he that was orator to Diabolus. He did much mischief in the town of Mansoul, and fell by the hand of Captain Goodhope. What shall I say? The Diabolonians in these days lay dead in every corner, though too many yet were alive in Mansoul. Now the old recorder and my lord Understanding, with some others of the chief of the town, to wit, such as knew they must stand and fall with the famous town of Mansoul, came together upon a day, and after consultation did jointly agree to draw up a petition, and to send it to Emmanuel, now while he sat in the gate of Mansoul. So they drew up their petition to Emmanuel, the contents whereof were these, that they, the old inhabitants of the now deplorable town of Mansoul, confessed their sin, and were sorry that they had offended his princely majesty, and prayed that he would spare their lives. Unto this petition he gave no answer at all, and that did trouble them yet so much the more. Now all this while the captains that were in the recorder's house were playing with the battering-rams at the gates of the castle to beat them down. So after some time, labour and travail, the gate of the castle that was called Impregnable was beaten open, and broken into several splinters, and so a way made to go up to the hold in which Diabolus had hid himself. Then were tidings sent down to Eargate, for Emmanuel still abode there, to let him know that a way was made in at the gates of the castle of Mansoul. But oh, how the trumpets at the tidings sounded throughout the prince's camp, for that now the war was so near an end, and Mansoul itself of being set free. Then the prince arose from the place where he was, and took with him such of his men of war as were fittest for that expedition, and marched up the street of Mansoul to the old recorder's house. Now the prince himself was clad all in armour of gold, and so he marched up the town with his standard borne before him. But he kept his countenance much reserved all the way as he went, so that the people could not tell how to gather to themselves love or hatred by his looks. Now as he marched up the street, the townsfolk came out at every door to see, and could not but be taken with his person and the glory thereof, but wondered at the reservedness of his countenance. For as yet he spake more to them by his actions and works than he did by words or smiles. But alas, poor Mansoul, as in such cases all are apt to do, they interpreted the carriage of Emmanuel to them as did Joseph's brethren his to them, even all the quite contrary way. For, thought they, if Emmanuel loved us, he would show it to us by word or carriage, but none of these he doth. Therefore Emmanuel hates us. Now if Emmanuel hates us, then Mansoul shall be slain, then Mansoul shall become a dunghill. They knew that they had transgressed his father's law, and that against him they had been in with Diabolus his enemy. They also knew that the Prince Emmanuel knew all this, for they were convinced that he was an angel of God, to know all things that are done in the earth, and this made them think that their condition was miserable, and that the good prince would make them desolate. And, thought they, What time so fit to do this in as now, when he has the bridle of Mansoul in his hand? And this I took special notice of, that the inhabitants, notwithstanding all this, could not, no, they could not, when they see him march through the town, but cringe, bow, bend, and were ready to lick the dust of his feet. They also wished 1,000 times over that he would become their prince and captain, and would become their protection. They would also one to another talk of the comeliness of his person, and how much for glory and valour he outstripped the great ones of the world. But, poor hearts, as to themselves, their thoughts would change, and go upon all manner of extremes. Yea, through the working of them backward and forward, Mansoul became as a ball tossed, and as a rolling thing before the whirlwind. Now when he was come to the castle gates, he commanded Diabolus to appear, and to surrender himself into his hands. But oh, how loath was the beast to appear! How he stuck at it! How he shrank! How he cringed! Yet out he came to the prince. Then Emmanuel commanded, and they took Diabolus and bound him fast in chains, the better to reserve him to the judgment that he had appointed for him. But Diabolus stood up to entreat for himself that Emmanuel would not send him into the deep, but suffer him to depart out of Mansoul in peace. When Emmanuel had taken him and bound him in chains, he led him into the market-place, and there, before Mansoul, stripped him of his armour in which he boasted so much before. This now was one of the acts of triumph of Emmanuel over his enemy, and all the while that the giant was stripping, the trumpets of the Golden Prince did sound amain. The captains also shouted, and the soldiers did sing for joy. Then was Mansoul called upon to behold the beginning of Emmanuel's triumph over him in whom they so much had trusted, and of whom they so much had boasted in the days when he flattered them. Thus having made Diabolus naked in the eyes of Mansoul, and before the commanders of the prince, in the next place he commands that Diabolus should be bound with chains to his chariot wheels. Then leaving some of his forces, to wit, Captain Boanerges and Captain Conviction, as a guard for the castle gates, that resistance might be made on his behalf, if any that heretofore followed Diabolus should make an attempt to possess it, he did ride in triumph over him quite through the town of Mansoul, and so out at and before the gate called Eye-gate, to the plain where his camp did lie. But you cannot think, unless you had been there as I was, what a shout there was in Emmanuel's camp when they saw the tyrant bound by the hand of their noble prince and tied to his chariot wheels. And they said, He hath led captivity captive, he hath spoiled principalities and powers. Diabolus is subjected to the power of his sword, and made the object of all derision. Those also that rode reformades, and that came down to see the battle, they shouted with that greatness of voice, and sang with such melodious notes, that they caused them that dwell in the highest orbs to open their windows, put out their heads, and look down to see the cause of that glory. The townsmen also, so many as them as saw this sight, were, as it were, while they looked, betwixt the earth and the heavens. True, they could not tell what would be the issue of things as to them, but all things were done in such excellent methods, and I cannot tell how, but things in the management of them seemed to cast a smile towards the town, so that their eyes, their heads, their hearts, and their minds, and all that they had, were taken and held while they observed Emmanuel's order. So when the brave prince had finished this part of his triumph over Diabolus his foe, he turned him up in the midst of his contempt and shame, having given him a charge no more to be a possessor of Mansoul. Then went he from Emmanuel, and out of the midst of his camp, to inherit the parched places in a salt land, seeking rest, but finding none. End of chapter 5. Of the Holy War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Joy Chan. The Holy War by John Bunyan. Chapter 6. Now Captain Boanerges and Captain Conviction were, both of them, men of very great majesty. Their faces were like the faces of lions, and their words like the roaring of the sea. And they still quartered in Mr. Conscience's house, of whom mention was made before. When therefore the high and mighty prince had thus far finished his triumph over Diabolus, the townsmen had more leisure to view and to behold the actions of these noble captains. But the captains carried it with that terror and dread in all that they did, and you may be sure that they had private instructions so to do, that they kept the town under continual heart-aching, and caused, in their apprehension, the well-being of Mansoul for the future to hang in doubt before them, so that for some considerable time they knew neither what rest or ease or peace or hope meant. Nor did the prince himself as yet abide in the town of Mansoul, but in his royal pavilion in the camp, and in the midst of his father's forces. So, at a time convenient, he sent special orders to Captain Boanerges to summons Mansoul, the whole of the townsmen, into the castle yard, and then and there, before their faces, to take my Lord Understanding, Mr. Conscience, and that notable one, the Lord Will-be-will, and put them all three in ward, and that they should set a strong guard upon them there, until his pleasure concerning them was further known. The which orders, when the captains had put them in execution, made no small addition to the fears of the town of Mansoul, for now to their thinking were their former fears of the ruin of Mansoul confirmed. Now, what death they should die, and how long they should be in dying, was that which most perplexed their heads and hearts. Yea, they were afraid that Emmanuel would command them all into the deep, the place that the Prince Diabolus was afraid of, for they knew that they had deserved it. Also to die by the sword in the face of the town, and in the open way of disgrace, from the hand of so good and so holy a prince, that too troubled them sore. The town was also greatly troubled for the men that were committed to ward, for that they were their stay and their guide, and for that they believed that, if those men were cut off, their execution be but the beginning of the ruin of the town of Mansoul. Wherefore what do they, but, together with the men in prison, draw up a petition to the prince, and sent it to Emmanuel by the hand of Mr. Woodlive. So he went and came to the prince's quarters, and presented the petition, the sum of which was this: Great and wonderful potentate, victor over Diabolus and conqueror of the town of Mansoul, we, the miserable inhabitants of that most woeful corporation, do humbly beg that we may find favour in thy sight, and remember not against us former transgressions, nor yet the sins of the chief of our town, but spare us according to the greatness of thy mercy, and let us not die, but live in thy sight. So shall we be willing to be thy servants, and, if thou shalt think fit, to gather our meat under thy table. Amen. So the petitioner went, as was said, with his petition to the prince. And the prince took it at his hand, but sent him away with silence. This still afflicted the town of Mansoul. But yet, considering that now they must enter petition or die, for now they could not do anything else, therefore they consulted again, and sent another petition, and this petition was much after the form and method of the former. But when the petition was drawn up, by whom should they send it was the next question, for they would not send this by him by whom they sent the first, for they thought that the prince had taken some offence at the manner of his deportment before him. So they attempted to make Captain Conviction their messenger with it. But he said that he neither durst nor would petition Emmanuel for traitors, nor be to the prince an advocate for rebels. Yet withal, said he, our prince is good, and you may adventure to send it by the hand of one of your town, provided he went with a rope about his head, and pleaded nothing but mercy. Well, they made, through fear, their delays as long as they could, and longer the delays were good. But fearing at last the dangerousness of them, they thought, but with many a fainting in their minds, to send their petition by Mr. Desires Awake. So they sent for Mr. Desires Awake. Now he dwelt in a very mean cottage in Mansoul, and he came at his neighbour's request. So they told him what they had done, and what they would do, concerning petitioning, and that they did desire of him that he would go therewith to the prince. Then said Mr. Desires Awake, Why should not I do the best I can to save so famous a town as Mansoul from deserved destruction? They therefore delivered the petition to him, and told him how he must address himself to the prince, and wished him 10,000 good speeds. So he comes to the prince's pavilion as the first, and asked to speak with his majesty. So word was carried to Emmanuel, and the prince came out to the man. When Mr. Desires Awake saw the prince, he fell flat with his face to the ground, and cried out, "Oh, that Mansoul might live before thee!" And with that he presented the petition, the which when the prince had read, he turned away for a while and wept. But refraining himself, he turned again to the man, who all this while lay crying at his feet, as at the first, and said to him, "Go thy way to thy place, and I will consider of thy requests." Now you may think that they of Mansoul that had sent him, what with guilt and what with fear lest their petition should be rejected, could not but look with many a long look, and that too with strange workings of heart, to see what would become of their petition. At last they saw their messenger coming back. So when he was come, they asked him how he fared, what Emmanuel said, and what was become of the petition. But he told them that he would be silent till he came to the prison to my Lord Mayor, my Lord Will-be-will, and Mr. Recorder. So he went forwards towards the prison house, where the men of Mansoul lay bound. But oh, what a multitude flocked after, to hear what the messenger said! So when he was come and had shown himself at the gate of the prison, my Lord Mayor himself looked as white as a clout. The Recorder also did quake. But they asked and said, "Come, good sir, what did the great prince say to you?" Then said Mr. Desires Awake, "When I came to my lord's pavilion, I called, and he came forth. So I fell prostrate at his feet, and delivered to him my petition. For the greatness of his person and the glory of his countenance would not suffer me to stand upon my legs. Now as he received the petition, I cried, Oh, that Mansoul might live before thee! So when for a while he had looked thereon, he turned him about, and said to his servant, Go thy way to thy place again, and I will consider of thy requests. The messenger added moreover, and said, The prince to whom you sent me is such a one for beauty and glory, that whoso sees him must both love and fear him. I for my part can do no less, but I know not what will be the end of these things. At this answer they were all at a stand, both they in prison and they that followed the messenger thither to hear the news. Nor knew they what or what manner of interpretation to put upon what the prince had said. Now when the prison was cleared of the throng, the prisoners among themselves began to comment upon Emmanuel's words. My Lord Mayor said that the answer did not look with a rugged face, but Will-be-will said that it betokened evil, and the Recorder that it was a messenger of death. Now they that were left and that stood behind, and so could not so well hear what the prisoners said, some of them catched hold of one piece of a sentence, and some on a bit of another. Some took hold of what the messenger said, and some of the prisoners' judgment thereon. So none had the right understanding of things. But you cannot imagine what work these people made, and what a confusion there was in Mansoul now. For presently they that had heard what was said flew about the town, one crying one thing, and another the quite contrary, and both were sure enough they told true, for they did hear, they said, with their ears what was said, and therefore could not be deceived. One would say, We must all be killed. Another would say, We must all be saved. And a third would say that the prince would not be concerned with Mansoul, and a fourth that the prisoners must be suddenly put to death. And, as I said, every one stood to it that he told his tale the rightest, and that all others but he were out. Wherefore Mansoul had now molestation upon molestation, nor could any man know on what to rest the sole of his foot, for one would go by now, and as he went, if he heard his neighbour tell his tale, to be sure he would tell the quite contrary, and both would stand in it that he told the truth. Nay, some of them had got this story by the end, that the prince did intend to put Mansoul to the sword. And now it began to be dark, wherefore poor Mansoul was in sad perplexity all that night until the morning. But so far as I could gather by the best information that I could get, all this hubbub came through the words that the recorder said when he told them that, in his judgment, the prince's answer was a messenger of death. It was this that fired the town, and that began the fright in Mansoul, for Mansoul in former times did use to count that Mr. Recorder was a seer, and that his sentence was equal to the best of orators, and thus was Mansoul a terror to itself. And now did they begin to feel what were the effects of stubborn rebellion, and unlawful resistance against their prince. I say they now began to feel the effects thereof by guilt and fear, that now had swallowed them up. And who more involved in the one, but they that were most in the other, to wit, the chief of the town of Mansoul? To be brief, when the fame of the fright was out of the town, and the prisoners had a little recovered themselves, they take to themselves some heart, and think to petition the prince for life again. So they did draw up a third petition, the contents whereof were these: Prince Emmanuel the Great, Lord of all worlds and Master of mercy, we, thy poor, wretched, miserable, dying town of Mansoul, do confess unto thy great and glorious majesty that we have sinned against thy father and thee, and are no more worthy to be called thy Mansoul, but rather to be cast into the pit. If thou wilt slay us, we have deserved it. If thou wilt condemn us to the deep, we cannot but say thou art righteous. We cannot complain whatever thou dost, or however thou carriest it towards us. But, oh, let mercy reign, and let it be extended to us. Oh, let mercy take hold upon us, and free us from our transgressions, and we will sing of thy mercy and of thy judgment. Amen. This petition, when drawn up, was designed to be sent to the prince as the first. But who should carry it? That was the question. Some said, let him do it that went with the first. But others thought not good to do that, and that because he sped no better now, there was an old man in the town, and his name was Mr. Good-deed, a man that bare only the name, but had nothing of the nature of the thing. Now some were for sending him, but the recorder was by no means for that. For, said he, we now stand in need of, and are pleading for mercy. Wherefore to send our petition by a man of this name will seem to cross the petition itself. Should we make Mr. Good-deed our messenger, when our petition cries for mercy? Besides, quoth the old gentleman, should the prince now, as he receives the petition, ask him, and say, What is thy name? As nobody knows but he will. And he should say, Old Good-deed. What, think you, would Emmanuel say but this? Ah, is old Good yet alive in Mansoul? Then let old Good-deed save you from your distresses. And if he says so, I am sure we are lost, nor can 1,000 of old Good-deeds save Mansoul. After the recorder had given in his reasons why old Good-deed should not go with this petition to Emmanuel, the rest of the prisoners and chief of Mansoul opposed it also. And so old Good-deed was laid aside, and they agreed to send Mr. Desires-Awake again. So they sent for him, and desired him that he would a second time go with their petition to the prince, and he readily told them he would. But they bid him that in any wise he should take heed that in no word or carriage he gave offence to the prince. For by doing so, for aught we can tell, you may bring Mansoul into utter destruction, said they. Now Mr. Desires-Awake, when he saw that he must go on this errand, besought that they would grant that Mr. Wet-eyes might go with him. Now this Mr. Wet-eyes was a near neighbour of Mr. Desires, a poor man, a man of a broken spirit, yet one that could speak well to a petition. So they granted that he should go with him. Wherefore they addressed themselves to their business. Mr. Desires put a rope upon his head, and Mr. Wet-eyes went with his hands wringing together. Thus they went to the prince's pavilion. Now when they went to petition this third time, they were not without thoughts that, by often coming, they might be a burden to the prince. Wherefore when they were come to the door of his pavilion, they first made their apology for themselves, and for their coming to trouble Emmanuel so often. And they said that they came not hither today for that they delighted in being troublesome, or for that they delighted to hear themselves talk, but for that necessity caused them to come to his majesty. They could, they said, have no rest day nor night, because of their transgressions against Shaddai, and against Emmanuel his son. They also thought that some misbehaviour of Mr. Desires Awake the last time might give distaste to his highness, and so cause that he returned from so merciful a prince empty and without countenance. So when they had made this apology, Mr. Desires Awake cast himself prostrate upon the ground, as at the first, at the feet of the mighty prince, saying, "Oh, that Mansoul might live before thee!" And so he delivered his petition. The prince then, having read the petition, turned aside a while as before, and coming again to the place where the petitioner lay on the ground, he demanded what his name was, and of what esteem in the account of Mansoul, for that he, above all the multitude in Mansoul, should be sent to him upon such an errand. Then said the man to the prince, "O let not my lord be angry, and why inquirest thou after the name of such a dead dog as I am? Pass by, I pray thee, and take not notice of who I am, because there is, as thou very well knowest, so great a disproportion between me and thee. Why the townsmen chose to send me on this errand to my lord is best known to themselves, but it could not be for that they thought that I had favour with my lord. For my part, I am out of charity with myself. Who then should be in love with me? Yet live I would, and so would I that my townsmen should, and because both they and myself are guilty of great transgressions, therefore they have sent me, and I am come in their names to beg of my lord for mercy. Let it please thee therefore to incline to mercy, but ask not what thy servants are." Then said the prince, "And what is he that is become thy companion in this so weighty a matter?" So Mr. Desires told Emmanuel that he was a poor neighbour of his, and one of his most intimate associates. "And his name," said he, "may it please your most excellent majesty, is Wet Eyes, of the town of Mansoul. I know that there are many of that name that are naught, but I hope it will be no offence to my lord that I have brought my poor neighbour with me." Then Mr. Wet Eyes fell on his face to the ground, and made this apology for his coming with his neighbour to his lord. "O my lord," quoth he, "what I am I know not myself, nor whether my name be feigned or true, especially when I begin to think what some have said, namely, that this name was given me because Mr. Repentance was my father. Good men have bad children, and the sincere do oftentimes beget hypocrites. My mother also called me by this name from the cradle, but whether because of the moistness of my brain, or because of the softness of my heart, I cannot tell. I see dirt in mine own tears, and filthiness in the bottom of my prayers, but I pray thee," and all this while the gentleman wept, "that thou wouldst not remember against us our transgressions, nor take offence at the unqualifiedness of thy servants, but mercifully pass by the sin of man's soul, and refrain from the glorifying of thy grace no longer." So at his bidding they arose, and both stood trembling before him. And he spake to them to this purpose: "The town of Mansoul hath grievously rebelled against my father, in that they have rejected him from being their king, and did choose to themselves for their captain a liar, a murderer, and a runagate slave. For this Diabolus, your pretended prince, though once so highly accounted of by you, made rebellion against my father and me, even in our palace and highest court there, thinking to become a prince and a king. But being there timely discovered and apprehended, and for his wickedness bound in chains, and separated to the pit with those that were his companions, he offered himself to you, and you have received him. Now this is, and for a long time hath been, a high affront to my father. Wherefore my father sent to you a powerful army to reduce you to your obedience. But you know how these men, their captains and their counsels, were esteemed of you, and what they received at your hand. You rebelled against them, you shut your gates upon them, you bid them battle, you fought them, and fought for Diabolus against them. So they sent to my father for more power, and I with my men are come to subdue you. But as you treated the servants, so you treated their lord. You stood up in hostile manner against me, you shut up your gates against me. You turned the deaf ear to me, and resisted as long as you could. But now I have made a conquest of you. Did you cry me mercy so long as you had hopes that you might prevail against me? But now I have taken the town, you cry. But why did you not cry before, when the white flag of my mercy, the red flag of justice, and the black flag that threatened execution were set up to cite you to it? Now I have conquered your Diabolus, you come to me for favour. But why did you not help me against the mighty? Yet I will consider your petition, and will answer it so as will be for my glory. Go, bid Captain Boanerges and Captain Conviction bring the prisoners out to me into the camp tomorrow. And say you to Captain Judgment and Captain Execution, stay you in the castle, and take good heed to yourselves that you keep all quiet in Mansoul until you shall hear further from me. And with that he turned himself from them, and went into his royal pavilion again. So the petitioners, having received this answer from the prince, returned as at the first, to go to their companions again. But they had not gone far, but thoughts began to work in their minds that no mercy as yet was intended by the prince to Mansoul. So they went to the place where the prisoners lay bound. But these workings of mind about what would become of Mansoul had such strong power over them, that by that they were come unto them that sent them. They were scarce able to deliver their message. But they came at length to the gates of the town. Now the townsmen with earnestness were waiting for their return, where many met them, to know what answer was made to the petition. Then they cried out to those that were sent, What news from the prince? And what hath Emmanuel said? But they said that they must, as afore, go up to the prison, and there deliver their message. So away they went to the prison, with a multitude at their heels. Now when they were come to the gates of the prison, they told the first part of Emmanuel's speech to the prisoners, to wit, how he reflected upon their disloyalty to his father and himself, and how they had chosen and closed with Diabolus, had fought for him, hearkened to him, and been ruled by him, but had despised him and his men. This made the prisoners look pale, but the messengers proceeded and said, He, the prince, said, moreover, that yet he would consider your petition, and give such answer thereto as would stand with his glory. And as these words were spoken, Mr. Wet Eyes gave a great sigh. At this they were all of them struck into their dumps, and could not tell what to say. Fear also possessed them in a marvellous manner, and death seemed to sit upon some of their eyebrows. Now there was in the company a notable, sharp-witted fellow, a mean man of estate, and his name was Old Inquisitive. This man asked the petitioners if they had told out every whit of what Emmanuel said, and they answered, Verily no. Then said Inquisitive, I thought so indeed. Pray, what was it more that he said unto you? Then they paused a while, but at last they brought out all, saying, The prince bade us bid Captain Boanerges and Captain Conviction bring the prisoners down to him to-morrow, and that Captain Judgment and Captain Execution should take charge of the castle and town till they should hear further from him. They said also that when the prince had commanded them thus to do, he immediately turned his back upon them and went into his royal pavilion. But oh, how this return, and specially this last clause of it, that the prisoners must go out to the prince into the camp, break all their loins in pieces. Wherefore with one voice they set up a cry that reached up to the heavens. This done, each of the three prepared himself to die. And the recorder said unto them, This was the thing that I feared. For they concluded that to-morrow, by that the sun went down, they should be tumbled out of the world. The whole town also counted of no other, but that in their time and order they must all drink of the same cup. Wherefore the town of Mansoul spent that night in mourning and sackcloth and ashes. The prisoners also, when the time was come for them to go down before the prince, dressed themselves in mourning attire, with ropes upon their heads. The whole town of Mansoul also showed themselves upon the wall, all clad in mourning weeds, if, perhaps, the prince with the sight thereof might be moved with compassion. But oh, how the busybodies that were in the town of Mansoul did now concern themselves! They did run here and there through the streets of the town by companies, crying out as they ran in tumultuous wise, one after one manner, and another the quite contrary, to the almost utter distraction of Mansoul. Well, the time is come that the prisoners must go down to the camp and appear before the prince, and thus was the manner of their going down. Captain Boanerges went with a guard before them, and Captain Conviction came behind, and the prisoners went down, bound in chains in the midst. So I say the prisoners went in the midst, and the guard went with flying colours behind and before, but the prisoners went with drooping spirits. Or more particularly thus, the prisoners went down all in mourning. They put ropes upon themselves, they went on smiting themselves on the breasts, but durst not lift up their eyes to heaven. Thus they went out at the gate of Mansoul, till they came into the midst of the prince's army, the sight and glory of which did greatly heighten their affliction. Nor could they now longer forbear, but cry out aloud, O unhappy men! O wretched men of Mansoul! Their chains, still mixing their dolorous notes with the cries of the prisoners, made the noise more lamentable. So when they were come to the door of the prince's pavilion, they cast themselves prostrate upon the place. Then one went in and told his lord that the prisoners were come down. The prince then ascended a throne of state, and sent for the prisoners in, who, when they came, did tremble before him. Also they covered their faces with shame. Now as they drew near to the place where he sat, they threw themselves down before him. Then said the prince to the captain Boanerges, Bid the prisoners stand upon their feet. Then they stood trembling before him, and he said, Are you the men that heretofore were the servants of Shaddai? And they said, Yes, Lord, yes. Then said the prince again, Are you the men that did suffer yourselves to be corrupted and defiled by that abominable one, Diabolus? And they said, We did more than suffer it, Lord, for we chose it of our own mind. The prince asked further, saying, Could you have been content that your slavery should have continued under his tyranny as long as you had lived? Then said the prisoners, Yes, Lord, yes, for his ways were pleasing to our flesh, and we were grown aliens to a better state. And did you, said he, when I came up against this town of Mansoul, heartily wish that I might not have the victory over you? Yes, Lord, yes, they said. Then said the prince, And what punishment is it, think you, that you deserve at my hand for these and other your high and mighty sins? And they said, Both death and the deep, Lord, for we have deserved no less. He asked again if they had aught to say for themselves, why the sentence, that they confessed that they had deserved, should not be passed upon them. And they said, We can say nothing, Lord. Thou art just, for we have sinned. Then said the prince, And for what are those ropes on your heads? The prisoners answered, These ropes are to bind us withal to the place of execution, if mercy be not pleasing in thy sight. So he further asked if all the men in the town of Mansoul were in this confession as they. And they answered, All the natives, Lord, but for the Diabolonians that came into our town when the tyrant got possession of us, we can say nothing for them. Then the prince commanded that a herald should be called, and that he should, in the midst and throughout the camp of Emmanuel, proclaim, and that with sound of trumpet, that the prince, the son of Shaddai, had, in his father's name, and for his father's glory, gotten a perfect conquest and victory over Mansoul, and that the prisoners should follow him and say Amen. So this was done as he had commanded, and presently the music that was in the upper regions sounded melodiously. The captains that were in the camp shouted, and the soldiers did sing songs of triumph to the prince. The colours waved in the wind, and great joy was everywhere. Only it was wanting as yet in the hearts of the men of Mansoul. Then the prince called for the prisoners to come and to stand again before him. And they came and stood trembling. And he said unto them, The sins, trespasses, iniquities, that you, with the whole town of Mansoul, have from time to time committed against my father and me, I have power and commandment from my Father to forgive to the town of Mansoul, and do forgive you accordingly. And having so said, he gave them, written in parchment, and sealed with 7 seals, a large and general pardon, commanding my Lord Mayor, my Lord Will-be-will, and Mr. Recorder, to proclaim and cause it to be proclaimed tomorrow, by that the sun is up, throughout the whole town of Mansoul. Moreover, the prince stripped the prisoners of their mourning weeds, and gave them beauty for ashes, the oil of joy for mourning, and the garment of praise for the spirit of heaviness. Then he gave to each of the 3 jewels of gold and precious stones, and took away their robes, and put chains of gold about their necks, and earrings in their ears. Now the prisoners, when they did hear the gracious words of Prince Emmanuel, and had beheld all that was done unto them, fainted almost quite away. For the grace, the benefit, the pardon, was sudden, glorious, and so big, that they were not able, without staggering, to stand up under it. Yea, my Lord Will-be-will swooned outright. But the prince stepped to him, put his everlasting arms under him, embraced him, kissed him, and bid him be of good cheer, for all should be performed according to his word. He also did kiss and embrace and smile upon the other 2 that were Will-be-will's companions, saying, Take these as further tokens of my love, favour, and compassion to you, and I charge you that you, Mr. Recorder, tell in the town of Mansoul what you have heard and seen. Then were their fetters broken to pieces before their faces, and cast into the air, and their steps were enlarged under them. Then they fell down at the feet of the prince, and kissed his feet, and wetted them with tears. Also they cried out with a mighty strong voice, saying, Blessed be the glory of the Lord from this place. So they were bid rise up and go to the town, and tell to Mansoul what the prince had done. He commanded also that one with a pipe and tabor should go and play before them all the way into the town of Mansoul. Then was fulfilled what they never looked for, and they were made to possess that which they never dreamed of. The prince also called for the noble captain Credence, and commanded that he and some of his officers should march before the noble men of Mansoul with flying colours into the town. He gave also unto Captain Credence a charge, that about that time that the Recorder did read the general pardon in the town of Mansoul, that at that very time he should with flying colours march in at Eye-gate, with his 10,000 at his feet, and that he should so go until he came by the high street of the town, up to the castle gates, and that himself should take possession thereof against his lord came thither. He commanded moreover that he should bid Captain Judgment and Captain Execution to leave the stronghold to him, and to withdraw from Mansoul, and to return into the camp with speed unto the prince. And now was the town of Mansoul also delivered from the terror of the first 4 captains and their men. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of the Holy War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Joy Chan. The Holy War by John Bunyan. Chapter 7. Well, I told you before how the prisoners were entertained by the noble Prince Emmanuel, and how they behaved themselves before him, and how he sent them away to their home with pipe and tabor going before them. And now you must think that those of the town that had all this while waited to hear of their death could not but be exercised with sadness of mind, and with thoughts that pricked like thorns. nor could their thoughts be kept to any one point. The wind blew with them all this while at great uncertainties. Yea, their hearts were like a balance that had been disquieted with a shaking hand. But at last, as they with many a long looked over the wall of Mansoul, they thought that they saw some returning to the town, and thought again, who should they be, too? Who should they be? At last they discerned that they were the prisoners. But can you imagine how their hearts were surprised with wonder, especially when they perceived also in that equipage, and with what honour they were sent home? They went down to the camp in black, but they came back to the town in white. They went down to the camp in ropes, they came back in chains of gold. They went down to the camp with their feet in fetters, but came back with their steps enlarged under them. They went also to the camp looking for death, but they came back from thence with assurance of life. They went down to the camp with heavy hearts, but came back again with pipe and tabor playing before them. So as soon as they were come to Ighgate, the poor and tottering town of Mansoul adventured to give a shout, and they gave such a shout as made the captains in the prince's army leap at the sound thereof. Alas for them, poor hearts! Who could blame them, since their dead friends were come to life again? For it was to them as life from the dead to see the ancients of the town of Mansoul shine in such splendour. They looked for nothing but the axe and the block. But behold, joy and gladness, comfort and consolation, and such melodious notes attending them that was sufficient to make a sick man well. So when they came up, they saluted each other with, Welcome, welcome, and blessed be he that has spared you. They added also, We see it is well with you, but how must it go with the town of Mansoul? And will it go well with the town of Mansoul? Said they. Then answered them the recorder and my lord mayor, Oh, tidings, glad tidings, good tidings of good and of great joy to poor Mansoul. Then they gave another shout that made the earth to ring again. After this they inquired yet more particularly how things went in the camp, and what message they had from Emmanuel to the town. So they told them all passages that had happened to them at the camp, and everything that the prince did to them. This made Mansoul wonder at the wisdom and grace of the Prince Emmanuel. Then they told them what they had received at his hands for the whole town of Mansoul, and the recorder delivered it in these words, Pardon, pardon, pardon for Mansoul, and this shall Mansoul know to-morrow. Then he commanded, and they went and summoned Mansoul to meet together in the market-place to-morrow, then to hear their general pardon read. But who can think what a turn, what a change, what an alteration this hint of things did make in the countenance of the town of Mansoul? No man of Mansoul could sleep that night for joy. In every house there was joy and music, singing and making merry. Telling and hearing of Mansoul's happiness was then all that Mansoul had to do. And this was the burden of all their song. Oh, more of this at the rising of the sun, more of this to-morrow. Who thought yesterday, one would say, that this day would have been such a day to us? And who thought, that saw our prisoners go down in irons, that they would have returned in chains of gold? Yea, they that judged themselves as they went to be judged of their judge, were by his mouth acquitted, not for that they were innocent, but of the prince's mercy, and sent home with pipe and tabor. But is this the common custom of princes? Do they use to show such kind of favours to traitors? No, this is only peculiar to Shaddai, and unto Emmanuel his son. Now morning drew on apace, wherefore the Lord Mayor, the Lord Will-be-will, and Mr. Recorder came down to the market-place at the time that the Prince had appointed, where the townsfolk were waiting for them. And when they came in that attire and in that glory that the Prince had put them into the day before, and the street was lightened with their glory. So the Mayor, Recorder, and my Lord Will-be-will drew down to Mouthgate, which was at the lower end of the market-place, because that of old time was the place where they used to read public matters. Thither therefore they came in their robes, and their tabrets went before them. Now the eagerness of the people to know the full of the matter was great. Then the recorder stood up upon his feet, and, first beckoning with his hand for silence, he read out with a loud voice the pardon. But when he came to these words, the Lord God, merciful and gracious, pardoning iniquity, transgressions, and sins, and to them all manner of sin and blasphemy shall be forgiven, etc., they could not forbear leaping for joy. For this you must know, that there was conjoined herewith every man's name in Mansoul. Also the seals of the pardon made a brave show. When the recorder had made an end of reading the pardon, the townsmen ran up upon the walls of the town, and leapt and skipped thereon for joy, and bowed themselves 7 times with their faces towards Emmanuel's pavilion, and shouted out aloud for joy, and said, Let Emmanuel live for ever. Then order was given to the young men in Mansoul, that they should ring the bells for joy. So the bells did ring, and the people sing, and the music go in every house in Mansoul. When the prince had sent home the 3 prisoners of Mansoul with joy and pipe and tabor, he commanded his captains, with all the field officers and soldiers throughout his army, to be ready in that morning that the recorder should read the pardon in Mansoul, to do his further pleasure. So the morning, as I have showed, being come, just as the recorder had made an end of reading the pardon, Emmanuel commanded that all the trumpets in the camp should sound, that the colours should be displayed, half of them upon Mount Gracious, and half of them upon Mount Justice. He commanded also that all the captains should show themselves in all their harness, and that the soldiers should shout for joy. Nor was Captain Credence, though in the castle, silent in such a day, but he from the top of the hold showed himself with sound of trumpet to Mansoul and to the prince's camp. Thus have I showed you the manner and way that Emmanuel took to recover the town of Mansoul from under the hand and power of the tyrant Diabolus. Now when the prince had completed these, the outward ceremonies of his joy, he again commanded that his captains and soldiers should show unto Mansoul some feats of war. So they presently addressed themselves to this work. But oh, with what agility, nimbleness, dexterity, and bravery did these military men discover their skill in feats of war to the now gazing town of Mansoul! They marched, they countermarched, they opened to the right and left, they divided and subdivided, they closed, they wheeled, made good their front and rear with their right and left wings, and 20 things more with that aptness, and then were all as they were again, that they took, yea, ravished the hearts that were in Mansoul to behold it. But add to this, the handling of their arms, the managing of their weapons of war, were marvellously taking to Mansoul and me. When this action was over, the whole town of Mansoul came out as one man to the prince in the camp to thank him, and praise him for his abundant favour, and to beg that it would please his grace to come unto Mansoul with his men, and there to take up their quarters for ever. And this they did in most humble manner, bowing themselves 7 times to the ground before him. Then said he, All peace be to you. So the town came nigh and touched with the hand the toy of his golden sceptre, and they said, Oh, that the Prince Emmanuel with his captains and men of war would dwell in Mansoul for ever, and that his battering rams and slings might be lodged in her for the use and service of the prince, and for the help and strength of Mansoul. For, said they, we have room for thee, we have room for thy men, we have also room for thy weapons of war, and a place to make a magazine for thy carriages. Do it, Emmanuel, and thou shalt be king and captain in Mansoul for ever. Yea, govern thou also according to all the desire of thy soul, and make thou governors and princes under thee of thy captains and men of war, and we will become thy servants, and thy laws shall be our direction. They added moreover and prayed his majesty to consider thereof, for, said they, if now, after all this grace bestowed upon us, thy miserable town of Mansoul thou shouldst withdraw, thou and thy captains, from us, the town of Mansoul will die. Yea, said they, our blessed Emmanuel, if thou shouldst depart from us now thou hast done so much good for us, and showed so much mercy unto us, what will follow but that our joy will be as if it had not been, and our enemies will a second time come upon us with more rage than at the first? Wherefore we beseech thee, O thou the desire of our eyes, and the strength and life of our poor town, accept of this motion that now we have made unto our Lord, and come and dwell in the midst of us, and let us be thy people. Besides, Lord, we do not know but that to this day many Diabolonians may be yet lurking in the town of Mansoul, and they will betray us, when thou shalt leave us, into the hand of Diabolus again. And who knows what designs, plots, or contrivances have passed betwixt them about these things already? Loath we are to fall again into his horrible hands. Wherefore let it please thee to accept of our palace for thy place of residence, and of the houses of the best men in our town for the reception of thy soldiers and their furniture. Then said the prince, If I come to your town, will you suffer me further to prosecute that which is in mine heart against mine enemies and yours? Yea, will you help me in such undertakings? They answered, We know not what we shall do. We did not think once that we should have been such traitors to Shaddai as we have proved to be. What then shall we say to our Lord? Let him put no trust in his saints. Let the prince dwell in our castle, and make of our town a garrison. Let him set his noble captains and his warlike soldiers over us. Yea, let him conquer us with his love, and overcome us with his grace. And then surely shall he be but with us, and help us, as he was and did that morning that our pardon was read unto us. We shall comply with this our Lord, and with his ways, and fall in with his word against the mighty. One word more thy servants have done, and in this will trouble our Lord no more. We know not the depth of the wisdom of thee, our prince. Who could have thought, that had been ruled by his reason, that so much sweet as we do now enjoy should have come out of those bitter trials wherewith we were tried at the first? But, Lord, let light go before, and let love come after. Yea, take us by the hand, and lead us by thy counsels. And let this always abide upon us, that all things shall be for the best for thy servants, and come to our Mansoul, and do as it pleaseth thee. Or, Lord, come to our Mansoul, do what thou wilt, so thou keepest us from sinning, and makest us serviceable to thy majesty. Then said the prince to the town of Mansoul again, Go, return to your houses in peace. I will willingly in this comply with your desires. I will remove my royal pavilion. I will draw up my forces before Igate to-morrow, and so will march forwards into the town of Mansoul. I will possess myself of your castle of Mansoul, and will set my soldiers over you. Yea, I will yet do things in Mansoul that cannot be paralleled in any nation, country, or kingdom under heaven. Then did the men of Mansoul give a shout, and returned unto their houses in peace. They also told to their kindred and friends the good that Emmanuel had promised to Mansoul. And to-morrow, said they, he will march into our town, and take up his dwelling, he and his men, in Mansoul. Then went out the inhabitants of the town of Mansoul with haste to the green trees and to the meadows, to gather boughs and flowers, therewith to strew the streets against their prince, the son of Shaddai, should come. They also made garlands and other fine works to betoken how joyful they were, and should be, to receive their Emmanuel into Mansoul. Yea, they strewed the street quite from Igate to the castle gate, the place where the prince should be. They also prepared for his coming what music the town of Mansoul could afford, that they might play before him to the palace, his habitation. So at the time appointed he makes his approach to Mansoul, and the gates were set open for him. There also the ancients and the elders of Mansoul met him to salute him with 1,000 welcomes. Then he arose and entered Mansoul, he and all his servants. The elders of Mansoul did also go dancing before him, till he came to the castle gates. And this was the manner of his going up thither. He was clad in his golden armour, he rode in his royal chariot, the trumpets sounded about him, the colours were displayed. His 10,000s went up at his feet, and the elders of Mansoul danced before him. And now were the walls of the famous town of Mansoul filled with the tramplings of the inhabitants thereof, who went up thither to view the approach of the blessed prince and his royal army. Also the casements, windows, balconies, and tops of the houses were all now filled with persons of all sorts, to behold how their town was to be filled with good. Now when he was come so far into the town as to the recorder's house, he commanded that one should go to Captain Credence, to know whether the castle of Mansoul was prepared to entertain his royal presence, for the preparation of that was left to that captain. And word was brought that it was. Then was Captain Credence commanded also to come forth with his power to meet the prince, the which was, as he had commanded, done. And he conducted him into the castle. This done, the prince that night did lodge in the castle with his mighty captains and men of war, to the joy of the town of Mansoul. Now the next care of the townsfolk was, how the captains and soldiers of the prince's army should be quartered among them. And the care was not how they should shut their hands of them, but how they should fill their houses with them. For every man in Mansoul now had that esteem of Emmanuel and his men, that nothing grieved them more than because they were not enlarged enough, every one of them, to receive the whole army of the prince. Yea, they counted it their glory to be waiting upon them, and would in those days run at their bidding like lackeys. At last they came to this result. 1. That Captain Innocency should quarter at Mr. Reason's. 2. That Captain Patience should quarter at Mr. Mind's. This Mr. Mind was formerly the Lord Wilby-Will's clerk in time of the late rebellion. 3. It was ordered that Captain Charity should quarter at Mr. Affection's house. 4. That Captain Goodhope should quarter at my Lord Mayor's. Now for the house of the recorder himself desired, because his house was next to the castle, and because from him it was ordered by the prince that, if need be, the alarm should be given to Mansoul. It was, I say, desired by him that Captain Boanerges and Captain Conviction should take up their quarters with him, even they and all their men. 5. As for Captain Judgment and Captain Execution, my Lord Wilby-Will took them and their men to him, because he was to rule under the prince for the good of the town of Mansoul now, as he had before under the tyrant Diabolus for the hurt and damage thereof. 6. And throughout the rest of the town were quartered Emmanuel's forces, but Captain Credence with his men abode still in the castle. So the prince, his captains, and his soldiers were lodged in the town of Mansoul. Now the ancients and elders of the town of Mansoul thought that they never should have enough of the Prince Emmanuel. His person, his actions, his words and behaviour were so pleasing, so taking, so desirable to them. Wherefore they prayed him that though the castle of Mansoul was his place of residence, and they desired that he might dwell there for ever, yet that he would often visit the streets, houses, and people of Mansoul. For, said they, dread sovereign, thy presence, thy looks, thy smiles, thy words are the life and strength and sinews of the town of Mansoul. Besides this, they craved that they might have, without difficulty or interruption, continual access unto him. So for that very purpose he commanded that the gates should stand open, that they might there see the manner of his doings, the fortifications of the place, and the royal mansion-house of the prince. When he spake, they all stopped their mouths and gave audience, and when he walked, it was their delight to imitate him in his goings. Now upon a time Emmanuel made a feast for the town of Mansoul, and upon the feasting day the townsfolk were come to the castle to partake of his banquet, and he feasted them with all manner of outlandish food, food that grew not in the fields of Mansoul, nor in all the whole kingdom of the universe. It was food that came from his father's court. And so there was dish after dish set before them, and they were commanded freely to eat. But still, when a fresh dish was set before them, they would whisperingly say to each other, What is it? For they wist not what to call it. They drank also of the water that was made wine, and were very merry with him. There was music also all the while at the table, and man did eat angels' food, and had honey given him out of the rock. So Mansoul did eat the food that was peculiar to the court, yea, they had now thereof to the full. I must not forget to tell you, that as at this table there were musicians, so they were not those of the country, nor yet of the town of Mansoul, but they were the masters of the songs that were sung at the court of Shaddai. Now after the feast was over, Emmanuel was for entertaining the town of Mansoul with some curious riddles or secrets drawn up by his father's secretary, by the skill and wisdom of Shaddai. The like to these there is not in any kingdom. These riddles were made upon the king Shaddai himself, and upon Emmanuel his son, and upon his wars and doings with Mansoul. Emmanuel also expounded unto them some of those riddles himself. But oh, how they were lightened! They saw what they never saw. They could not have thought that such rarities could have been couched in so few and such ordinary words. I told you before whom these riddles did concern, and as they were opened, the people did evidently see it was so. Yea, they did gather that the things themselves were a kind of a portraiture, and that of Emmanuel himself. For when they read in the scheme where the riddles were writ, and looked in the face of the prince, things looked so like the one to the other, that Mansoul could not forbear but say, This is the lamb, this is the sacrifice, this is the rock, this is the red cow, this is the door, and this is the way, with a great many other things more. And thus he dismissed the town of Mansoul. But can you imagine how the people of the corporation were taken with this entertainment? Oh, they were transported with joy. They were drowned with wonderment, while they saw and understood, and considered what their Emmanuel entertained them withal, and what mysteries he opened to them. And when they were at home in their houses, and in their most retired places, they could not but sing of him and of his actions. Yea, so taken were the townsmen now with their prince, that they would sing of him in their sleep. Now it was in the heart of Prince Emmanuel to new model the town of Mansoul, and to put it into such a condition as might be most pleasing to him, and that might best stand with the profit and security of the now flourishing town of Mansoul. He provided also against insurrections at home, and invasions from abroad. Such love had he for the famous town of Mansoul. Wherefore he first of all commanded that the great slings that were brought from his father's court, when he came to the war of Mansoul, should be mounted, some upon the battlements of the castle, some upon the towers. For there were towers in the town of Mansoul, towers new built by Emmanuel since he came hither. There was also an instrument invented by Emmanuel, that was to throw stones from the castle of Mansoul out at Mouth Gate, an instrument that could not be resisted, nor that would miss of execution. Wherefore, for the wonderful exploits that it did when used, it went without a name, and it was committed to the care of, and to be managed by, the brave captain, the Captain Credence, in case of war. This done, Emmanuel called the Lord Will-be-will to him, and gave him in commandment to take care of the gates, the wall, and towers in Mansoul. Also the prince gave him the militia into his hand, and a special charge to withstand all insurrections and tumults that might be made in Mansoul against the peace of our lord the king, and the peace and tranquillity of the town of Mansoul. He also gave him in commission that if he found any of the Diabolonians lurking in any corner of the famous town of Mansoul, he should forthwith apprehend them, and stay with them, or commit them to safe custody, that they may be proceeded against according to the law. Then he called unto him the Lord Understanding, who was the old Lord Mayor, he that was put out of place when Diabolus took the town, and put him into his former office again, and it became his place for his lifetime. He bid him also that he should build him a palace near Ighgate, and that he should build it in fashion like a tower for defence. He bid him also that he should read in the revelation of mysteries all the days of his life, that he might know how to perform his office aright. He also made Mr. Knowledge the recorder, not of contempt to old Mr. Conscience, who had been recorder before, but for that it was in his princely mind to confer upon Mr. Conscience another employ, of which he told the old gentleman he should know more hereafter. Then he commanded that the image of Diabolus should be taken down from the place where it was set up, and that they should destroy it utterly, beating it into powder, and casting it into the wind without the town wall, and that the image of Shaddai his father should be set up again with his own upon the castle gates, and that it should be more fairly drawn than ever, forasmuch as both his father and himself were come to man's soul in more grace and mercy than heretofore.
He would also that his name should be fairly engraven upon the front of the town, and that it should be done in the best of gold, for the honour of the town of Mansoul. After this was done, Emmanuel gave out a commandment that those 3 great Diabolonians should be apprehended, namely, the 2 late Lord Mayors, to wit, Mr. Incredulity, Mr. Lustings, and Mr. Forgetgood, the recorder. Besides these, there were some of them that Diabolus made burgesses and aldermen in Mansoul. They were committed to ward by the hand of the now valiant and now right noble, the brave Lord Wilbywill. And these were their names: Alderman Atheism, Alderman Hard Heart, and Alderman False Peace. The burgesses were Mr. No Truth, Mr. Pitiless, Mr. Haughty, with the like. These were committed to close custody, and the jailor's name was Mr. True Man. This True Man was one of those that Emmanuel brought with him from his father's court when at the first he made a war upon Diabolus in the town of Mansoul. After this the prince gave a charge that the 3 strongholds that, at the command of Diabolus, the Diabolonians built in Mansoul, should be demolished and utterly pulled down, of which holds and their names with their captains and governors you read a little before. But this was long in doing, because of the largeness of the places, and because the stones, the timber, the iron, and all the rubbish was to be carried without the town. When this was done, the prince gave order that the Lord Mayor and aldermen of Mansoul should call a court of judicature for the trial and execution of the Diabolonians in the corporation now under the charge of Mr. True Man, the jailor. End of chapter 7.